In 1923, a city health inspector showed up at a cramped tenement on Mulberry Street in Manhattan. Inside, he discovered Rosa Caruso curing pork from overhead pipes, a cloth-wrapped wheel of homemade cheese resting by the window, and a pot of tripe simmering on the stove with an overpowering aroma. He issued her a $3 fine. She handed over the money and then carried on cooking as if nothing had happened. That scene repeated itself across Little Itali's from New York to Chicago to San Francisco for decades. Italian grandmothers did not just cook food American health inspectors had never seen. They cured it in bedrooms, fermented it in basement, and brined it in bathtubs. They foraged in city parks. They slaughtered animals in back alleys. They made wine during Prohibition and hid it behind false walls. They were called unsanitary, dangerous, a public health menace, and here is the twist. Scientists and food historians are now circling back to these same recipes and calling them something different. Genius, culturally irreplaceable. Some of the most nutritionally dense, microbiologically sophisticated food traditions ever carried to this country. Number 7 on this list was specifically banned by the New York City Board of Health in 1934. Number 3 violates FDA guidelines to this day. And number 1, the dish that anchored every Sunday table from South Philly to Boston's North End, was called a public health hazard in 1952 by the same government shipping processed cheese in tin cans to school cafeterias. These 20 recipes did not disappear because they were wrong. They disappeared because America decided it knew better than the women who had been perfecting them for 500 years. Let's start the countdown. Number 20. Sunday gravy with pork neck bones. Every Italian-American family called it something different. Gravy sauce, the red. But the Sunday ritual was the same from Staten Island to San Jose. Pork neck bones browned hard in cast iron until the fat rendered gold, then submerged in crushed San Marzano tomatoes and left to simmer for 4, 5, sometimes 6 hours. In the 1940s, neck bones cost about 8 cents a pound at the corner butcher. Families who had left poverty in Calabria and Sicily understood that bone, marrow, and connective tissue, cooked low and slow, released a depth of flavor no lean cut could match. The collagen broke down into gelatin. The marrow enriched the sauce. The tomato acid softened through hours of heat into something smooth and complex that no 90-minute version could ever replicate. Health inspectors sometimes flagged the long room temperature, standing time, and the uncovered pots left warming overnight. Italian grandmothers nodded and ignored them completely. They had been making this gravy since before anyone in an American uniform was born. Number 19, lardo on toast. Walk into an Italian grocery in East Harlem in 1938, and you would see white slabs of it stacked in the cold case. Cured fatback, pure pork fat salted with rosemary, garlic, and black pepper, then aged for weeks in marble basins or ceramic crocks, sliced paper thin over warm bread. It melted on the tongue into something so silky it seemed impossible it came from a 5-cent cut. By the 1950s, regulations on cured pork fat effectively pushed lardo out of most Italian-American delis. The tradition went underground, made in apartments and cellars consumed at family tables where no inspector would ever knock. In 2003, the FDA attempted to block the importation of authentic Italian lardo on food safety grounds. The outcry from food historians reversed the decision within months. The same product your grandmother made in a coffee tin in the Bronx was declared artisanal, imported at $30 a pound to Manhattan restaurants and sold on charcuterie boards. Number 18, brazzi stuffed with hard-boiled egg. This was the dish that separated Sunday from every other day of the week. Thin slices of beef pounded flat, layered with breadcrumbs, garlic, parsley, pine nuts, raisins, and whole hard-boiled eggs, then rolled tight, tied with twine, and braised for hours in Sunday gravy until the meat turned dark and tender and the egg inside sliced into a perfect golden spiral. When cut at the table, that cross-section revealed rings of white and yolk surrounded by seasoned beef. It looked like it required professional training. It required patience, a pound of bottom round, and knowledge passed from hand to hand across generations. Health officials in the 1940s were suspicious of eggs held inside cooked meat for extended periods. Brasi did not appear on restaurant menus. It stayed in kitchens where grandmothers knew that what they were doing was not dangerous. It was chemistry practice long before chemistry had a name. Number 17, ciccioli, fried pork fat cracklings. When a pig was butchered, nothing was wasted. The scraps of fat and skin left after rendering lard were pressed, fried again until crisp and packed into crocks. Ciccioli were the byproduct of thrift, but they were also among the most intensely flavored things your grandmother ever set on the table, dense, salty, crackling between the teeth. They were eaten with bread or stirred into polenta. Italian neighborhoods in Providence, Utica, and Cleveland had butcher shops selling ciccioli by the bag through the 1960s. When industrial meat processing arrived and small butchers lost access to whole animals, ciccioli vanished almost overnight. You cannot make them without the scraps, and supermarkets sell no scraps. The tradition survived only in private kitchens passed down by families who still knew someone willing to sell them the parts the packing plant called waste. Number 16, zuppa drippa trappi's soup with tomato and mint. Friday was a meatless day in the Italian Catholic calendar, but Trippi occupied a theological gray area that grandmothers exploited with considerable creativity. Clean tripe simmered for hours with tomato, onion, celery, and fresh mint until silky and tender, and it was the Friday meal that filled every seat at the table. The mint cut through the richness, lifted the broth, and transformed what smelled like an alley behind a butcher shop into something you could not stop eating. In the 1950s, Italian butchers on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx sold tripe daily. By the 1980s, as that generation aged and moved to the suburbs, the market collapsed. The last Trip butcher on Arthur Avenue closed in 1991. His daughter, who did not cook it herself, said people just did not want it anymore. What she meant was that the people who wanted it were gone, and nobody had bothered to teach the next generation why it mattered. Number 15, homemade wine, the basement prohibition vintage. During Prohibition, a specific exemption allowed heads of household to produce up to 200 gallons of fruit juice per year for personal use. Italian grandfathers across America read that law carefully, nodded, and promptly began making wine. The grapes came by rail from California, unloaded at stations in Brooklyn and Chicago, and handed off to men who had been making wine since they were 12 years old in Campa. The basement of row houses became cellars. The whole neighborhood smelled of fermenting must every September. The wine was almost never particularly good by objective measure, but it was made by hand, poured at every Sunday table, and it tasted like home. When Prohibition ended, the tradition did not. Italian-American families kept making basement wine through the 1950s and the 1960s, long after they could buy it legally. The recipe was never written anywhere. It lived in the hands. Number 14, cotacino, gelatinous pork sausage simmered for hours. This was a sausage America did not understand, made from pork rind, fat, and seasoned mince stuffed into natural casing and simmered for 3 to 4 hours until the gelatin softened the casing into something almost translucent. Cotacino was served sliced over lentils on New Year's Day and at Sunday tables throughout winter. The texture was unlike any American sausage. Soft, almost spreadable, rich with gelatin, its casing yielding between the teeth. The seasonings, clove, nutmeg, cinnamon alongside pepper and salt, had no American equivalent and no American frame of reference. Health officials flagged the long simmering at uncertain temperatures. Italian grandmothers flagged the absurdity of people who knew nothing about food telling them how to cook it. Cotacino today appears on Italian restaurant menus at $22 a plate. Described as artisanal and house-made, your great-grandfather bought it from the pork store on the corner for 40 cents and simmered it next to the radiator on Christmas Eve. Number 13. Crudeo. Raw salted fish at the Sunday table. Southern Italian coastal communities had been eating raw salt-cured fish for centuries before anyone invented refrigeration. Anchovies packed in salt, sardines cured in ceramic jars, thin slices of raw tuna dressed with olive oil and lemon. The salt did the work that cold could not, drawing moisture, concentrating flavor, and creating conditions no pathogen could survive. In the 1950s, American regulators could not distinguish between raw and unsafe and raw but preserved. They saw fish that was not cooked, and they reached for the citation book. Restaurants in New York's Little Italy stopped serving crudeo by the 1960s. Grandmothers continued pulling salt-packed anchovies from the jar under the sink, watching grandchildren make faces and come back for seconds. The FDA today still prohibits the commercial sale of many traditionally salt-cured raw fish preparations that your grandmother needed no certification to make. Number 12. Arnini made from day-old risotto and ragu. This dish was born entirely from the refusal to waste. Leftover risotto, cold and stiff, was stuffed with a spoonful of Sundae ragu, a cube of mozzarella, and a few peas. Then it was rolled in breadcrumbs and fried until the outside shattered, and the inside went molten and golden. Health officials worried about reused cooked rice. American food safety guidelines treated it with deep suspicion after unrelated commercial kitchen incidents in the 1940s. Those prohibitions targeted large-scale food handling and had nothing to do with Italian grandmothers who stored their risotto for 12 hours, then fried it to order. Italian delis in New York were cited for selling arancini made from day-old rice. The grandmothers made